I just wanted to say just a few words just to introduce sort of how this Bernardo as a choice for a keynote speaker fits in with our theme this year. And I wanted to acknowledge that I know a lot of you have seen your newsrooms shrink in recent years. I know that there have been pay cuts and furloughs, there have been buyouts, there have been layoffs. We have seen an entire newspaper chain shut down. And I know that some of you have gone to work in this environment of diminished resources, and you have sat among the empty desks, and I know that you have asked yourselves the question, why am I doing this? What, am I crazy to keep doing this? But I also know, because I work in a newsroom full of people who feel like I do, that we do this because we can't imagine doing anything else. Journalism is more than a profession, it's a way of viewing the world. You are not just people who work in a newsroom, but by nature you are observers, you are researchers, you are storytellers, you are question askers, you are watchdogs. And if you're doing it right, you know that it doesn't matter where you work and that you really are not working for your boss or the corporation that owns your chain. You're working for the people who listen to and read and view your stories. You're working for the neighbors that you live next to. You're working for the people in line in front of you at the grocery store. And you want to reflect their world back to them. You want to explain what's happening in the political world. You want to protect their interests. And I think that is probably why so many of you related to the themes in Bernardo's film, because at its core, it understands what drives journalists and it makes the case for journalism. So please help me welcome our 2003 keynote speaker, director and producer of Reportero, Bernardo Ruiz.
Thank you. I first of all just want to say thank you to Julia for the invitation and to the entire Alaska Press Club team. You're so nice in your presentation, but you cajoled and you pushed, and that's why I came too. So that's a big part of why I'm here. So thank you so much for the invitation. So I'm sure a lot of you are wondering why the Alaska Press Club would invite a documentary filmmaker to talk to a room full of journalists. And it's a really good question. You know, whether you're an aspiring journalist, a working journalist, or a recovering journalist, you know, why am I talking to you? I don't work as a reporter for a paper, a radio outlet, or a network, but journalism is at the heart of what I do. And more importantly, a few years ago, I set myself the task of making a film about reporters, stubborn reporters. My time with them really changed the way I think about the profession, and it made me realize that what everyone in this room does, no matter what your slice of the story and no matter what your platform, is critically important. Now more than ever, especially. But the ability to do this work is not something that we should ever take for granted or ever take lightly. Just to quickly establish my roots in reporting, when I was 17, I moved to Washington State from Brooklyn, New York, where I grew up. There's of course a story there, but basically I needed fresh air and a new environment. The experience was a little bit like a cross between Twin Peaks and the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I wasn't rapping, I wasn't cool, I didn't have a high top fade, no hip hop. But at the end of my junior year in Washington State, I managed to stumble upon this thing called the Urban Journalism Workshop. And it was a project put on by the University of Washington and the Seattle Times. And basically it was a 2-week program for aspiring high school journalists where we learned how to interrogate public officials, elected officials, how to edit, how to take photographs and print photographs. And we actually put out a print newspaper called the Urban Journal, which I still have in my apartment back in New York. That little introduction into the world of journalism really got me started down this path. So this is also a kind of a plug for high school journalism programs. It's incredible what you can kickstart with just a little bit of nudging. And that goes on. That goes on for college as well. We need more of those types of programs. So, how did this particular story, with regards to Reportero, the documentary that I made, how did that start? So about 3 years ago, I was driving along a stretch of highway in northern Mexico with a very uncooperative GPS. I was sure I was headed in the right direction until the blinking lights of the city I was aiming for vanished in my rear view. And if you've never seen it, there's nothing more embarrassing or more ridiculous than a New Yorker trying to, find his way in the Mexican desert. Maybe driving around Alaska is equally ridiculous for me. But at any rate, I was lost. So after the fifth or sixth utterance of recalculating from the GPS, I tossed it in the glove compartment, made a U-turn, and headed back to what I hoped was my destination. I was headed to a meeting with a Mexican reporter who I'd only talked to on the phone. And as I headed back the way I came, I remember passing a slaughterhouse. I was thinking to myself, I have absolutely no, and you can insert your favorite expletive here, I have absolutely no clue what I'm doing here. I'd set up the meeting with this reporter precisely because I didn't know what I was doing. Somewhat arrogantly, I decided that I was going to make a film about this very unique stretch of the California-Mexico border. It encompasses these twin cities of Mexicali and Calexico. They're kind of two cities that are tied together economically, politically, and also through the narcotics trade. So I began my research into the area starting in 2007. I thought at first I would focus on the shelter for deported kids, for deported teenagers. And finally in 2009, I raised some money. I was able to go down to the shelter, and I began interviewing teens from El Salvador, Honduras, the hard-hit states of Mexico, basically teens who'd attempted to enter the US unsuccessfully. Oftentimes, they and their families had paid large sums to smugglers or coyotes only to see those investments evaporate when they were apprehended by Border Patrol. But I quickly realized that what I really needed was local knowledge. And more than local knowledge, I really needed someone to help me sift through the details of this place, and someone who could help me glimpse the kind of bigger picture of what was going on in the region. And at the time, between 2007 and 2009, the bigger picture in northern Mexico was pretty ugly. It has changed somewhat, though not enough, unfortunately. The rising wave of narco violence was claiming tens of thousands of lives, not only in the Mexican border states, but in other pockets throughout the country. Basically, everyone I talked to had a story about how their lives had been transformed by this new, arguably more vicious wave of violence in Mexico. I remember a young woman telling me a story about how an uncle had been brutally murdered, another person telling me about a relative who'd been kidnapped. Of course, their businesses that had shuttered, closed their doors to avoid having to pay bribes to local crime bosses. And the violence was getting coverage in the US, but from my perspective, the coverage was disjointed. It lacked any kind of meaningful context. The stories that were coming out of cable, sensationalized cable, were just bodies in the street stories, beheadings and the like. It's like what I like to call rubbernecking or vulture journalism. No context. And there was no real mention of what the conflict was really about, no sense of the forces at play. More importantly, no sense of how this conflict was affecting people. People on the ground, ordinary citizens of the US and Mexico who are caught up in a conflict that seems to be completely out of control. So I remember thinking to myself, are there people out there who know this place inside and out? Are there people who are working in this area with integrity? Are there people out there who are recording the daily life of this place? And after asking these questions around town, really naively, I finally got the answer I was looking for. The shelter, the director and founder of the youth shelter just bluntly said, "Why don't you try a local reporter?" And it just hit me like a ton of bricks. Duh, I've spent a few years just banging around and I'm really not getting anywhere. So without missing a beat, she gave me the name of a veteran reporter who's a little bit of a local legend albeit someone who has never been recognized nationally or internationally for his work. His name was Sergio Ardo of the weekly Zeta. And Zeta is a kind of legendary crime paper based out of Tijuana, but they also have, they cover Mexicali, which is the state capital. So luckily for me, Sergio is a really patient guy. We had made an appointment to meet at a Starbucks on the edge of the shopping mall. And when I finally arrived after doing circles in the desert, and it was a little difficult to explain why I'd gone so far out of my way, away from the shopping mall. I mean, we literally went into the desert. He received me very warmly, and he said there aren't too many Starbucks franchises in the deserts of Baja Norte, at least not yet anyway. But Sergio kind of heard me out, and I could see a smile creeping across his face. And I know he must have been thinking, what is this guy doing here? He doesn't really have a clue. He was understandably a little wary at first, and I was a little all over the place in my questions. But eventually, we settled into a good, long conversation. And once it started, actually, it was hard to stop. I mentioned this last night in the screening, but that first meeting was like a good first date. Whenever I bring that up, it makes Sergio, who's this veteran crime reporter, it always makes him cringe. But it's the truth. It was like a good first date. So I asked Sergio, a lot of questions, and after talking to him for a little while, I realized that he was like a Where's Waldo of the U.S.-Mexico border. Through hundreds of dispatches and photographs, Sergio shoots photographs and he writes. He's borne witness to his native Mexicali and the surrounding border region for nearly 3 decades. His work is a kaleidoscopic record of place. It's also a testament to his dogged commitment to the job. And as an example, kind of charting his chronology, how he's a kind of Where's Waldo. In '89, he covered the first time that a gubernatorial election was conceded to an opposition party in 6 decades, which was very big news in Mexico. So you had outside reporters, California reporters who came in for a couple days, and then they left. In March of '94, Sergio covered the bloody assassination of a presidential candidate at a campaign rally in Tijuana. He snapped shots of armed men grabbing the shooter and whisking him off into an SUV. To this day, the event holds the same fascination, and it provokes the same kind of debate in Mexico that the Kennedy assassination does here in the US. So Sergio was there covering these stories in his backyard. And again, for that story, international media came in for a couple of days, they parachuted in, parachuted right back out. In July of '97, he buried a close friend and colleague, a brash young reporter named Benjamin Flores. Flores had been denouncing the activities of a local trafficker, and for his reporting, he received 3 shots to the head and six to the back on the steps of his own newspaper. Again, for this story, a New York Times reporter came in for a couple days and came back out. The story made the New York Times Sunday magazine, but the reporter spent a short amount of time there. And finally, in the spring of '99, Sergio received his very first death threat. Why? He published a piece criticizing the early release of his friend's killer. The murderer received a sentence of less than 2 years. So for this one piece, Sergio's whole life was turned upside down. He had to send his wife and young son to another state. The then Attorney General dispatched armed guards to protect him 24 hours a day. A friend even offered to lend him a gun. And there's actually a funny story in the film. It doesn't sound funny as I'm telling it, but it's a funny story in the film where Sergio's friend gave him a gun, and Sergio, who has been a writer his whole life, had no idea how to use a gun, and so he took it out into the desert, fired a few shots, and very quickly realized that he was a terrible shot and just gave the gun back. He said, I'll be worse off with this thing. He also, once he gave the gun back, he also dispatched his guards. He very quickly realized that the guards that were hired to protect him were as corrupt and dangerous as the men who were after him. In one sequence, he also told me that, in one interview, that the very guard who was hired to protect him tried to get Sergio to go in on a deal to extort another guy in town, that they together could go in on this deal. So he let the guards go. And so there he is, without his wife, without his son, no guards, no gun. And what does he do? He keeps on reporting, not only on what he's going through, but what's happening in the region. So Sergio, this lifelong reporter, he becomes the story. Eventually, and thankfully, the man alleged to have made these threats ends up in jail on an unrelated charge. Not for threatening a journalist, but on an unrelated drug trafficking charge. And long after the US and national Mexican papers left, Sergio kept reporting, telling the story of the city that he's grown up in. I think that so much of documentary filmmaking, and by extension reporting, is about timing. Sometimes people are ready to talk, and if we're doing our jobs well, we're ready to listen, really listen. After nearly 30 years of reporting, Sergio, in that first meeting, he was ready to connect the dots, and I think he saw me as the vehicle. It is always good to have a plan when you go out for a story or to make a film. It's good to have a strategy, especially when you're on deadline. And I was reminded of this yesterday by Robert Smith's excellent talk. But sometimes you need to be willing to take that plan or strategy and just toss it out the window. Sometimes the thing that brought you there isn't the story. And sometimes stories have to be messy. So in the case of the film I made, I scrapped my original idea completely of making this film about a youth shelter and deported kids, and decided I needed to make a film about this journalist and his colleagues. I knew that all the narrative threads I'd been chasing, immigration, the rise of narco power, political corruption, they all passed through this one journalist's story. And his story was much more urgent than anything I'd originally conceived of. And most importantly, I had this compelling central character and someone who's willing to talk. You always need that person who's willing to talk. It struck me that this local reporter, that his beat was actually not so local. I suspect that this is nothing new to folks who cover local stories or who have quote-unquote local beats. International trade, immigration, human trafficking, the drug war, cross-border politics, you name it. They all play out in Sergio's ostensibly local beat. I wanted to touch on these stories through Sergio's eyes. I also wanted to look at what it means to do your job in a place where the press is under assault in no uncertain terms. Since December of 2006, there have been at least 54 reporters and media workers who've been murdered or who have disappeared in Mexico when the former Mexican president, Felipe Calderón, came to power and launched a government offensive against the country's powerful drug cartels and organized crime groups. And that's actually a fairly conservative estimate from the Committee to Protect Journalists. So what does it mean to do your work when papers around you are declaring that they will no longer cover organized crime or news for fear of retribution? There was a very famous case in September of 2010 out of a daily just south of El Paso, the Diario de Juárez, where they actually wrote an open letter to what they called the de facto authorities, and they said, you who are really in charge in this city, you tell us what we should and what we shouldn't write. We're tired of losing reporters, we're tired of having our offices grenaded, we're tired of losing our people. You let us know what the rules are. What are the new rules? Because the state government can't protect us anymore. So what does it mean to be reporting in this context? To report on the activities of organized crime, corrupt politicians, much less just tell the human stories, the day-to-day stories. What does it mean? What goes through a reporter's mind when they're about to break a story that, as Sergio says in the film, is like a grenade before you remove the pin? Why would you persist when there's so many risks and there's so few benefits? And something that Sergio said to me, he borrowed a line from the deceased Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya's final dispatches. Is journalism worth dying for? Is this something that we need to die for? Most reporters, and at least the good ones, don't like to be the story. So it definitely took a lot of convincing to get Sergio to go from our off-camera conversations to an on-camera interview. I did pre-interviews on the phone, by email, at a taqueria near the offices of his paper, sometimes in the dark of his living room in Mexicali, waiting for the intense heat of the city to dissipate. All of those conversations, those interviews, are the basis for the film that I made. And once I had a sense of how I wanted to tell the story, I went back and worked in a more targeted way. And again, what Robert Smith said yesterday was the process of hunting versus gathering as a reporter or as a filmmaker. Local journalists are very much the memory of a place, and Sergio is no exception. His dispatches chronicle the stories of his region in miniature, often with glimpses of the bigger picture, and often the stories that pack the biggest punch are the quiet ones. One deceptively simple piece that stands out and that isn't about organized crime, that isn't about the big, flashy narco wars, is a story called Calexico Swap Meet USA. It was published in the Mexican daily newspaper La Jornada. So in just 7 paragraphs, he tells the story of a woman named Adriana who wakes up in the city of Mexicali in the morning, talks her way into a ride that takes her across the border into California, into Calexico. She lands in Calexico and lands a day gig selling used shoes at a swap meet. Very, very simple story. Using simple language, the piece is a quick snapshot of the swap meets. The cross-border trade that's the economic engine of the region. And he ends the simple piece by this detail of her clutching the $20 that she made on her way back into Mexicali, in the city, the $20 that she earned for the day. Very, very simple story, and most of his writing is like that. Sergio understands that sometimes the back door, the small detail is the best way into a story. When I first read his reporting, it reminded me of Jimmy Breslin's story in the New York Herald Tribune about the Kennedy assassination, in which Breslin approached the Kennedy funeral from the perspective of the gravedigger, just talking about how much the guy earned per hour, what he had for breakfast. It was this incredible way into a much bigger story. Sometimes those smaller, neglected details are the ones that carry the most emotional weight. Something about Sergio's reporting also reminded me of the veteran Middle East correspondent Anthony Shadid, who died last year, and I'm paraphrasing. So when you're covering a conflict, any kind of conflict, political, economic, what matters is not so much the conflict, but the people at the center of the conflict. Ultimately, I decided to build a documentary film around this stubborn reporter and his colleagues, is because they place people at the center of their reporting. Rather than trying to understand the big picture phenomena from this very wide lens, rather than going down the road of point, counterpoint, sometimes with false equivalencies, what Sergio and his colleagues do is to try to create portraits of people's lives, the way they live them day in and day out. His reporting is a reminder, it's a temperature check. In our stories and our reporting, what do we remember and what do we forget? What are we covering and what are we missing? Why are we producing these stories and for which audience? The film that I made is basically Sergio's story, but it's also the stories of his colleagues in the newspaper where he spent most of his career, SETA, which is no relation to the cartel of the same name. Sergio is not the only local reporter in the film. There's the Jesus Blancornelas, who's the founder of the paper, who survived an attack by 10 hired killers. It's also the story of a fellow murdered columnist, and it's also the story of Adela Navarro, the very dynamic editor of the newspaper, who, when I first met her, was wearing high heels as she stepped out of an armored car. I think a project like this, and I think so much of local reporting, is about getting the story behind the story. And while that's a cliche, we do need to move beyond the headlines, definitely beyond the cable news crawl, to showing the lives of individual people. Through telling these more personal stories, we're allowing people to see that there's a slice of the story that, to be able to look at a story in a completely new way. In the film, what we try to do is show the dignity, not just of the journalists, but the everyday people of Mexico who are living lives despite a very, very difficult context. Thankfully, most of you in this room, hopefully most of you in this room, don't have to put your lives on the line to do your work in the way that Sergio and his colleagues do. But his work, and I don't mean to, this sounds like almost like a eulogy for him, so I hope that's not, he's very much alive and working well and doing great stuff, and he's a very funny guy too. But his work is a reminder that we can always dig a little deeper, push a little harder, and tell even more intimate stories. One of the things that I really enjoyed about following him while making the documentary is that I got to spend time with what here in this country we would call an old school journalist, an old school investigative reporter working for a print weekly. There's no social media, there's no online anything. He's writing for a weekly print paper that's economically successful. It feels like a throwback to another era. And to be honest, I felt a kind of nostalgia when I was filming those printing presses where they do the print runs. Every week SETA prints about 30,000 issues, and they actually print on the California side of the border. They don't print in Mexico, because in the early days of the paper, there was a great fear of censorship, and the Mexican government controlled paper sales. So if they liked what you printed, they'd sell you paper. If they didn't like what you printed, all of a sudden the rates would get jacked up, or papers, the sales would get blocked in one way or another. So to this day, they print on the California side, and every Friday at dawn, they truck the 30,000 issues back into northern Mexico for distribution throughout Mexico. So it definitely spent a lot of time filming these beautiful old printing presses as they're running these old papers. So what Reportero and Sergio have taught me about kind of day in, day out journalism is that, again, the work that can pack the biggest punch is that everyday journalism. What we see in Reportero is how local knowledge, an understanding of the personalities and the forces at play, and sometimes having skin in the game, can make for a very potent form of journalism. Sergio's very last line in the film, "It still gets to me." And I know it sounds a little cheesy to be talking about the film that you made as an element from the film getting to you, but I also don't feel like it's entirely my film. I feel like it's his story. But it's one of the nice things about documentaries is that it's really hard to have complete ownership of them. They're one part you and one part something else. But at the close of the film, Sergio says, from the day I started this until the day I finished, I've always wanted to be a reporter. So I hope that little piece of his experiences can be a kind of reminder in moments of frustration, disappointment, definitely economic insecurity, that telling the everyday story is probably the most important thing we can do.